Chris, I am always so excited to catch up with you to talk about agility. Thank you so much for joining us.
As always, Gretchen, it's a pleasure to hang out and chat with you about one of my favorite subjects. I'm sure we won't have enough time to cover everything, but we'll give it a whirl.
We will give it a whirl. And before we start, I wanted to tell you that one of my students in another course on their own read your book and complimented you on the use of different examples in every chapter. So some positive feedback from one of my students. So how did you become interested in studying agility to begin with?
It's sort of I'll give you the short version because the long version is sort of, I've always been studying it. We just didn't always call it that. Even when I was doing my doctorate, I was just very curious about the notions of organization change, organization development, and how those paired with our ideas around strategy. So it's always been something I've been interested in, and that interest has morphed and evolved as I've continued to do research on it. At one point, I think if we bring it a little closer to today, it was sort of about a good friend of mine, Tom Cummings. I was talking to him about what I wanted to do for my next research project, and he said, well, have you talked to Ed Lawler? Because he's talking about doing the same thing. And then I talked to Ed, and in fact, we were kind of thinking about the same idea, and that's how we ended up writing Built to Change, which I think sort of started this most recent progression. But it's all about how does change and design and strategy all fit together.
Very complicated topics, change and strategy. How did the 4 routines evolve? How did that framework come about?
So if you go back to the Built to Change book, all we were trying to do was, in essence, sort of create a vision. What do we know about those 3 subjects? Like you said, each one of them is kind of their own topic. And as we were thinking about it, what did we learn? What do we know from both research and practice about those 3 things? And did we have examples of companies who were figuring out ways to change in sort of routine ways? So a lot of the ideas for the routines came out of that book, and that book was mostly, again, conceptual. It wasn't there wasn't much empirical work there, and we decided based on that to go ahead and move forward, and we generated a survey that tried to map these different ideas that were included in Built to Change, and push those out to organizations that we were working with at the Center for Effective Organizations at USC, and just companies that we sort of knew and were involved with, and tried to bring them in as much as we could. And the 4 routines, there's an interesting story here. The different concepts that we were using were based on org design models like Jay Galbraith's STAR model. And he has strategy and structure and processes and rewards. And we tried to map a lot of our topics to those. And so we ended up with these, I don't know, it's like 10 scales of, change-friendly identity, or, flexible structure, or change capability. And we thought we had it until we started talking to managers, and the sort of the realization is managers don't think in terms of the STAR model. No. They think in terms of broader kinds of bigger issues. And the things that we thought, were all structural issues or all strategy issues, managers were putting those together in different ways. So if you look at those different routines, sometimes there's things that go together in those routines that you might not think of as an org design person.
Right.
And so those 4 routines truly are data-based, and it came from both the survey itself and then talking to managers about how they were putting those different ideas together and how they were looking at their organization.
Yeah, I think that's one thing I love about your model, Chris, is that it's backed with research and the extensive data that you've looked at, but it's practical because you've embedded it in, you haven't sat, you're not sitting in some research lab by yourselves thinking about
Ivory
this. You're
tower,
actually, yeah, exactly, out talking to people. So let's talk about the 4 routines, agile strategizing. What is it that you think organizations either really get right or really get wrong about agile strategizing?
I think the piece of it that people are becoming more aware of is the identity piece. I think we've in the strategy, from the strategy literature, I think we're getting pretty good at coming up with strategies that are robust and can operate under multiple conditions. In VUCA environments, right, we need strategies that can work. So I think we've got that. I think people also understand the notion of purpose and does your organization exist for something beyond profit and growth? So I think we're getting that. What I think people don't get is the identity piece as much. And that there's an internal cultural conversation, how we talk about ourselves to ourselves when we're, with each other. And then there's things that we say to the environment, to regulators, to market forces, to customers. We tell them who we are. And I think organizations sort of miss the notion that sometimes those two conversations are not the same thing.
Yeah.
We tell everybody we're customer focused, and then when they try to reach us, it's impossible to talk to somebody on the phone. You got to go through, layers and layers of AI to get to a real person to talk to. And, people inside organizations, they know that doesn't feel right to say that we're customer centric and then to have to know that our customers are having to go through this to talk to us.
Right.
So I think that's one of the ones that I think people are sort of gaining some appreciation for. You've got to be clear about who you are, and everything needs to line up to that.
Yeah. I call that, throwing the BS flag, right? Your employees are going to sense it if you're taking a message out to market that's not being lived internally and really embedded in our culture. I think that's,
I like it.
Yeah.
I'm going to steal that one. I'm going to steal that one from you. BS flag.
BS flag. Yeah, it is. And I think the other one is that having flat organizations, as many contact points as you can with your external environment that are, feeding, and it ties into this perceiving strategy. So what do you think organizations are getting right and wrong when it comes to agile perceiving?
Yeah, I like the way you picked up on perceiving as one of those ones where you would say, why does structure fall into the perceiving routine? That's a great example of what I was talking about earlier, where, the way managers look at it is different. I think this whole COVID-19 thing is laying bare the notion of being future focused. Organizations were not ready. I mean, the vast majority of cases, I think a lot of our talk about being future focused and concerned about, this stakeholder and that stakeholder and this stakeholder, and trying to be connected with them and looking out into the future and standing in the future and looking back and saying, what should I do now? I think we have a lot of people who are a little embarrassed by how much the COVID-19 virus has revealed about our narrow-mindedness. And so one of the things I'm talking with a lot of organizations, talking with them about right now, is this notion of you got caught and you didn't know what to do, and the least of us are paying for it. The frontline workers are paying for it. The people who have to go to work every day are paying for it. And the lack of preparedness is really showing up in the world. And so that's the one I would really pick out today as as one that we maybe talk a better game than we actually do.
Yeah, it's interesting because having done so much of my consulting in the construction industry, and I sit on the board of a large general contractor now, I find construction companies, they're very good at the data collection. I mean, they can drown themselves in data trends and economic trends, but it's the decision making, feeding that into the decision making process and determining which of these weak signals, as futurists say, that we should be paying attention to. I feel like that's a little bit more of the challenge. Do you find that?
Yeah, because the organization, I'm back right now. My thing is about it, the COVID crisis has revealed stuff. And one of the things it's revealed is that we say it's good to look to the future. We want to pick out the noises. But because we're over-rotated towards shareholders and how well we're using our capital, I don't want to waste my time on that.
Right.
And so now we end up sort of focusing on being efficient. And in being efficient, we push out anything that might look like slack, might look like preparedness. We push all that out because we want to be efficient. And in doing so, we've created this system that is tightly interdependent. And when one thing comes along and trips the whole system up, everything falls apart. So I agree with you on the notion of decision making, that information has to come into the leadership suite in some way, and it has to be given its due. And all the data around us, I think, justifies that that sort of recommendation or push.
Yeah, and going to Pierre Vac and his great work in scenario planning, and his quotes as saying, "It's thinking the unthinkable that it's fearful. It creates fear in people."
Exactly. Efficiency and bureaucracy can't stand change. It can't stand it. So thinking about what you might do is inviting uncertainty into the boardroom, and that's very uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So I think this is one of these things we're learning.
Yeah. So agile testing, it was interesting in reviewing my PhD study, 47 corporations. This was, I don't know that I can say 100% of the time, but largely one of the lowest scoring areas for companies in my study. What are we getting right, and what are we getting wrong in testing new ideas?
Yeah. Your study reflects the work that we've been doing. Testing is by far the lowest scoring of the 4 routines across organizations, across industries. So that's the key part. If you sort of peel away the onion inside the testing routine, it's not that organizations are not encouraging innovation. They are. They recognize it as fuel for the future. Most organizations are getting better at moving resources around, people, budget, time, right, to try and support innovation. They're getting better at it. That's not the one that's holding the testing routine down. The one that's holding it down is the learning part, right? It's putting in the time and the systems to think about, what did we learn from that experience, that digital initiative, that failed experiment? What did we learn from that, and how are we going to take that and apply it to future notions and ideas? And I don't remember if it's in the book, but the organization I use a lot for this is 3M. And the 3M has this built-in routine for exploring the successes and the failures of their different innovation projects. And what they've learned, again, the key here is the learning piece. What they've learned is it's more important to document their failures than their successes.
Wow.
When they document their successes, of course, it helps them scale up technologies, products, that sort of things to domestic and global markets. But what they really learned was, when they documented their failures, a failed innovation usually failed because of something that wasn't ready. The materials wasn't ready, production technology wasn't ready, markets weren't ready, customers weren't ready, supply chain wasn't ready. And there was something that just sort of prevented the whole system from being successful. Well, any one of those things is continually changing. So if it was a materials issue that prevented the innovation from succeeding, put that on the shelf and let the materials technology go on. It's now available. You pull that off the shelf. 3M looks really fast and speedy in their innovation and decision making. I argue it's not speed, it's preparation. They're prepared to go fast because they've documented all their failures, and a failure is just a moment in time. You learn something new, you can pull that innovation and put it out in the marketplace very quickly.
Yeah. I'm laughing because 20 years ago, working for a large consulting firm, I suggested that we start sharing client failures, not, fall flat on your face failures, and everyone said, well, that's a really great idea. And I said, great, I'll go first in our monthly staff meeting. So I talked about a challenge. I was the only one who ever did it. Nobody else would ever stand up and talk about it. But, getting people to learn, worked on a 3-year billion-dollar construction project, and getting everybody to sit down at the end of that, we'd implemented some really innovative things around lean practices, et cetera. But everybody's often running to the next thing and didn't really have time to feed it into the system.
Yeah, I'm going to show my age a little bit, but I've got a favorite line from an old Dan Fogelberg song that says, "Winners never know the worth of losing." And I try and get people to understand that, successes are great and we can learn from those. But boy, I got to tell you, if I think about my own career, I've learned more from my failures than my successes. And I just think we're in a place now where we need to be more open to understanding that organizations need to recognize that how valuable a failure is. And we see it in the agile methodologies. They're trying to fail fast, fail forward, rapidly iterate, prototype, try it out. And again, one of the things I think we're learning from the COVID thing is governments that tried to stop things early were able to learn faster, and it didn't cost as much.
Yes.
Or systems, organizations, and governments that waited too long and then started trying things out, which were new and novel, and they made mistakes and it cost lives. So this whole notion of learning and trying to put learning back into the organization in as much as it can, I think is crucial.
Yes. And the interlinkages between the 4 routines, let's talk about Agile implementation. And a story popped into my head, but implementation, it seems like such a simple word, right?
Yeah.
And then we just implement it.
Go execute. Yeah.
No big deal, right?
Yeah.
So what are organizations getting right and wrong when it comes to Agile implementation?
It's easy if you're looking at the implementing routine, it's easy to focus on the change capability that's in there. And that's the one I'm going to talk about. But it's got to be supported. And so we're seeing, especially as digitalization rolls along, the importance of changing the way people think about leadership and moving from more traditional command and control, top-down sort of leadership perspectives to more shared leadership, responsible leadership. I hope we're moving in the right direction there. The thing about the change capability that gets missed a little bit when people talk about this is the notion that all of our change management models and processes tell you how to make one change at a time. What's happening today in VUCA worlds is we have multiple changes happening at the same time.
Yes.
And so there was a point in the book when we were trying to decide, do we call it implementing or do we call it orchestrating? And I actually think that's a pretty good metaphor for the kinds of things that Agile organizations are able to do. They orchestrate multiple changes so that you're working on that digital initiative. You're a little ahead of everybody else. Take your foot off the gas a little bit and let us work on this human resource practice or training initiative over here so we can build the skills up as necessary or a structural initiative that takes out some layers or some intermediaries that allows the digital technology to thrive and deliver on its results. Those are multiple changes happening at once. And that's what I think the people are missing is, well, let's just put some more change management resources on that. That's not going to do it. What you need is somebody orchestrating. So PMOs become very important. Sort of finding a way to blend project management with some of the more people-oriented side of things. Mm-hmm. And in the digital stuff that we're doing, we've come up with this phrase that I really like, and it's a technical lead, social lag. The technology is way ahead,
right?
But we're behind on the social systems, the social structures that are necessary to support that technology and get the most out of it.
Yeah. It's interesting when I think to implementing 3 years ago, working with a client that decided to implement lean practices and integrated project delivery, IPD contracts. And so going to much more collaborative model and a lean model. And I asked them, I said, well, what new skills do you think your project managers are going to need to operate in this new world? Zero consideration
Yeah.
for the personal skills. Like they had, okay, we're going to do pull planning, but what do we need to operate in this? So thinking about those new capabilities that need to be developed as you're implementing a new strategy, I think is really important.
Yeah, and the funny part is we know all this. This is old research. This is old data. And it just seems as the digitalization trend has come on, what's happened is we've forgotten. And we're the bright, shiny objects of AI and robotics and Internet of Things. I think we've forgotten some of the things that we know about socio-technical systems and how they're put together.
Yeah. Speaking of which, so that's one of the questions I wanted to ask you. What are some of the biggest mistakes you see out there that organizations are making that are actually deliberately trying to become more agile? What are they tripping up on?
It's a good one. The last set of data that I collected in a global sample with the agility survey, what we found was there is no sort of agreed upon way to make the transition from traditional, kind of an organization to a more agile form. The number of ways, top down, bottom up, outside in, PMO, diagnostic led, they were all over the map. So we don't know, right, if there is a best way. There may not be, but certainly nothing is coming to the fore.
Right.
But back to your question, I think there's two things in particular. One is I'm going to come back to a leadership issue, and that is if you're going to make a transformation in your organization from, again, some sort of traditional organization to an agile organization, that's probably going to take some level of commitment from the top. There's going to have to be somebody that says, this is the right thing to do. I'm going to put some resources behind this, and I'm going to put my shoulder and the shoulder of the leadership team into this and really, get the organization pushed off a little bit in a direction that's consistent with agility. The mistake that happens then is they get that started, but they begin to realize that in order to be successful, that program then needs to shift in a leadership focus from me pushing to allowing you in the middle to lead. And it's the development of that shared leadership perspective. And it's a very difficult double bind for an executive right now to say, I want my organization to be agile, and I've got to kick that off and then hand over a lot of power to the middle managers to run the business so that those of us at the top of the organization can think about the future, play with the future, figure out these scenarios, have discussions about what we would do if something really crazy happens. So when it does happen, we're ready to go. So I think there's a leadership shift that has to take place there, and it's a pretty, it can be threatening. I rose to the top. I got to the top of the organization. I have power now. I should use it. And to start agility makes sense, but now to keep agility going, I have to give that power away.
Yeah. It's so important, that shared leadership. And I literally was just talking about this yesterday in a lecture at Australian National University about, you do have to drive it. Somebody does have to be the champion of different thinking within an organization, but it really does need to take hold. And it is that middle management, middle leadership, and preparing them for what it's going to take to lean in, as you said, and to make this happen, and to shift cultures and go through the complicated things. The story that I was going to share earlier, I was in Singapore, Thailand, Cambodia, and Singapore in February of 2020, and came back into Australia and went to the gym, and the trainers were all still high-fiving everybody when they went in the gym. And I said, I don't think this is a really good idea, having the perspective of just having come out of Singapore. And they looked at me like, I think, crazy old lady in the gym, and just kept right on high-fiving people. And 3 weeks later, they were closed. And so getting people to break out of the box, even thinking about what agile might look like, being that champion and having the courage to stand up and say, we're facing a different world. We have to change our culture. We need to build new routines. So if you're our students out there, and I'll close with this question, and you're thinking about, I really my team needs to be more agile, or my organization, or I need to think about it differently. Where do you start? Like, what are some tips for them as we're closing out this interview?
Yeah. I'll go back to our first question. Remember, I started all this because I was curious about the way org change and strategy and design fit together. And one of the things that I learned long ago, and it stays with me, is how powerful diagnosis is, how powerful assessment is. If your organization has been around for more than 5 years, you've beat the odds, right? If you're a 10, 20, 50, 100-year-old organization, you've really beat the odds. But if you're surviving, then there's something about your organization that is contributing to that. And just to make it simple, I think it's one of the 4 routines. So if you want to become more agile, that means understanding which of the 4 routines are strong and weak inside your organization, and then beginning to target the weaker ones and raising those up without losing the strength of right? So maybe you're good at strategizing. Hold on to that one and add a routine to your quiver, right? So that you've got something else to rely on. So what I think is, and I think it goes back to this data set that says, I don't know if there's one way to do this. Every time I've worked with an organization to make the transition, it's always been different because they started out from a different place. They were strong. They had really good innovation testing routine. They had good learning, but they couldn't implement what they found to be true, or they had no perceiving routine, and they were always constantly getting surprised by customer requests or competitor announcements or something. And so I think it's really important to still go back and understand your organization's strengths and weaknesses today, find out which of those routines is the best one, reinforce it, hold on to it, and then add another.
And how great that you've developed a diagnostic tool, the survey, which is the survey that I used in my PhD study to help organizations understand this, because as a consultant, clients often come to me describing a problem, and we dig into it, they have an entirely different problem. And so, as you said, and don't lose those strengths. It's like the person on the Ed Sullivan show years ago with the plate spinning, right? Keep one plate spinning while you're getting other plates spinning and going.
Exactly.
Chris,
right.
I could talk to you for hours about agility. It's such a gift to be able to speak to you directly, and I know our students are going to benefit so much from your comments. Thank you so much for taking this time.
Absolute pleasure, Gretchen. Always willing to chat about this topic anytime, anywhere.
Thank you.
Thank you.